Hi, I'm Jay Phelan. Let's learn some biology. I want to talk about rubber. In fact, I want to argue here that rubber is among the pinnacles of human culture. Specifically, the vulcanization of rubber. This is a chemical process by which we take this plant product, we treat it chemically so that it becomes moldable, stronger, lasts longer. We've been talking about how the biology of organisms, particularly of mammals, including humans, builds in some constraints where there are asymmetries, for instance, in initial investment in reproduction between males and females. Let's start by looking at something that I'll call the fundamental reproductive equation. Fundamental reproductive equation starts like this. It says sex equals pregnancy. I hope you didn't have to write that down, but you've learned some biology today. No, that's a biological truth. We know this. We also know this. Here's a second step in this fundamental reproductive equation. Pregnancy leads to babies. Now you're feeling really silly for writing that down. Nonetheless, you got to learn it sometime. Next step of the equation. Babies equal maternal child care. We've already talked about this. A defining feature of mammals is female lactation. That's how the earlier nurturing of the offspring goes. The next step of this equation is this. Maternal child care leads to a loss of female economic power. When you are nurturing babies, you have reduced opportunity to get jobs, rise up in a job, to gain some economic resources. The next step in this fundamental reproductive equation says this. It says loss of female economic power leads to a loss of female political power. So we go from something that starts just with the way our biology works. When people have sex, it leads to pregnancy. And all of a sudden it trickles down to this consequence that isn't intended, but we see it come about in culture after culture after culture. I said I wanted to talk about rubber. We defined culture previously as the extracellular transmission of information. That is, ideas. Rather than information being passed down from generation to generation, carried within genes, we can just tell people. So I can tell someone how to do agriculture, and now they have that, and that can influence their fitness just the way a better allele might. As part of culture, an idea, we can think of technology, such as the chemistry behind the vulcanization of rubber. But here's why it's important. Because these built-in constraints of our biology lead to this undesirable and common outcome. Where does rubber come in? Well, the very first step in our equation, condoms, made out of vulcanized rubber. And what do? They help us break down the fundamental reproductive equation so that we can get better outcomes. By this I mean sex doesn't have to equal pregnancy. When that's true, you can have better family planning, spacing of offspring, delay in when someone wants to have their first offspring, and so on. You get a bunch of additional control. But that's not the end of vulcanized rubber. Pregnancy maybe still occurs. People still decide they want to have babies. But vulcanized rubber comes in again. We see in the history of surgery, one of the greatest advances came with the vulcanization of rubber, because then surgical instruments could use vulcanized rubber so that they could be sterilized. We had rubber gloves in modern surgery, allowing much safer surgery to be done all over the place. This, again, helps us to break down the fundamental reproductive equation. Why? Because if you have safe, legal abortion, pregnancy doesn't have to lead to babies. So yet again, this biological drive that's just kind of built into us doesn't necessarily have to lead to a bad outcome. Our culture allows us to control it a little bit better. But let's say, sex still occurs, pregnancy still occurs, babies still occur. Do babies have to lead to maternal child care? Well, here, vulcanized rubber again. Here's Jack, my son, when he was little. You look at this picture and where's Julia? I don't know. She was at work. So who's taking care of him? Well, I am, because with vulcanized rubber, you can make nipples for baby bottles. All of a sudden, the mother doesn't have to be the person that is feeding the offspring. Someone else can do it. The father can do it. Babysitter can do it. Some other family member can do it. Vulcanized rubber allows us to break down the fundamental reproductive equations so that sex doesn't have to equal pregnancy, babies, maternal child care, which then is going to get us to those bad outcomes. 3 steps here, all can be broken down through our culture. It's culture sort of turning back one of the outcomes that we would have gotten from our biology. Now, does maternal child care have to lead to loss of female economic opportunity? Well, we've got some other aspects of culture that can influence this as well. So for instance, we can, with rule of law and with ideas, we can come up with ideas such as parental leave policies, guarantee a job for someone if they leave it to have kids. They can come back. Well, we can come up with this. This is an idea. This is culture. And we can have governmental reforms that say we're going to make rules that ensure that maternal or paternal investment in offspring doesn't have to have negative consequences for your job and your ability to earn money. So again, we have culture breaking down the fundamental reproductive equation. Loss of female economic power. So let's say, even though we can break all of these steps in the equation, let's say we still end up with a world where females have less economic power than males. How does our culture influence that? Who's this? Maybe you've seen her before. She's the new Prime Minister of Finland. Or this, Namibia's youngest member of Parliament. Or her, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, same thing. Does she have lots and lots of money? No. Or this. Do you know who this is? Forbes ranked her among the top 5 most powerful women in the world for about 10 years running. Yulia Tymoshenko, the Prime Minister of the Ukraine. And you look here she is with world leaders, Putin, Bush. Without having a huge amount of money, how do these people somehow get political power? Well, there's an answer to that too, and it's about culture, right? In a word, democracy. We can come up with an idea that says you don't have to be rich to be in power. Everybody can vote. Anybody can run for office. Your political power doesn't have to be tied to the economic opportunity that you have. Again, this is an aspect of culture that is layered on top of our biology. So with an idea like this, and there are other ideas, I'm just giving you one group of ideas that all have the effect of minimizing what previously would have been the outcomes from some of our biological constraints. We see across the world where, for instance, in India, huge numbers of young people without that much economic opportunity taking part in democratic elections. Here we see Angela Merkel, for 10 years running, ranked by Forbes as the most powerful woman in the world. Is it because she's hugely wealthy? No. It's because she has been elected. She has been given the political power because of her ideas. And here we see her with, among the most powerful people in the world. She's there with one US president, then another, then another, then another. They come and go, and she's still there. How does that happen? Even in a world where we have these biological constraints? What happens through culture? This is an important thing for us to recognize, is that biology is nudging us in certain ways. Biology is constraining certain things, but that doesn't mean that it's inevitable. That doesn't mean that we don't have power over it. We do, and that's a big part of what culture can do. We can see that the fundamental reproductive equation can be broken every step of the way. Because of this, it's comforting, it's hopeful for me that we can see that culture can free us from our biological constraints, and it can make equality possible. Now I say possible. I say it can free us from our biological constraints. I'm not saying that they've gone away. We're still built that way. in a lot of situations, we see that those biological constraints still influence the outcomes that we see in the world. It's not a yes-no. Things are not black and white. There are these complex shades of gray that say, yes, there's a lot of influence on culture in determining how things go in our world. There's a lot of influence of our biology, as we've seen throughout this entire term. Here's a question that I want you to ponder. One of the ideas I talked about, democracy. But you can think about this with respect to any of the ideas that I talked about, cultural ideas that break down the fundamental reproductive equation. You will see people challenging these. You will see people fighting these. You will see people trying to cause them to be less available, less important in the world. And I want you to think about, why might that be? Why would we find people around the world, cross-culturally, fighting the breakdown of the fundamental reproductive equation? Not everyone, but some people. So think about that. For your answer to this, you're going to have to go back to our discussions of altruism, kindness. What motivates people's behavior? So hopefully you can get some insight into that and why knowing about something isn't always sufficient to get the outcome that you want. It's one step, but then you have action as well. I'll stop here.